It was a night drenched in rain, the kind that seemed to wash soot from London's cobblestones yet leave behind an even deeper sense of gloom. Gas lamps sputtered in the downpour, their halos blurred against the mist that curled through narrow alleys. On Whitechapel Road, just past midnight, a single constable pulled his cape tighter around his shoulders as he approached a little shop wedged between a pawnbroker and a shuttered bakery. The wooden sign above the door bore a faded name, Thaddeus Pike, toymaker. It was not unusual for London's constables to respond to complaints of foul smells, especially in poorer districts where refuse piled and drains clogged. But this complaint was different. The odor had been described by neighbors as unbearable sweet, metallic and corrupt, seeping from cracks in the toy shop door even when it was shut tight. The constable rapped on the door with his truncheon, calling Pike's name. No answer. With a steady push, the door creaked open. Inside, the lantern's beam revealed a world frozen in stillness. Rows of dolls lined the shelves, their painted porcelain faces gleaming in the dim light. Tiny mouths fixed in eternal smiles, glass eyes wide and unblinking. The air was thick with the stench so overpowering that the constable gagged, covering his mouth with a gloved hand. He pressed further into the shop. Wooden horses stood frozen mid-gallop, tin soldiers arrayed in perfect ranks. Yet it was not the toys themselves that unsettled him, but the silence that pressed down upon the room. No ticking clock, no creak of floorboards, only the rain tapping against the window panes. At the back, a half-closed door led into the workshop. The constable hesitated, then pushed it open. The light swept across a workbench cluttered with needles, scraps of fabric, and spools of thread. On the bench lay a doll, unfinished, its porcelain face detached, its body a patchwork of cloth roughly stitched together. But what spilled from the seams was not cotton or straw. The stuffing was coarse, fibrous, and stained with a sickly red. The constable staggered back, lantern nearly slipping from his grasp. His first thought was of some grotesque mistake, some accident of animal hide or meat stored improperly. But then he saw more. On the shelves above the bench sat other dolls, their seams puckered, their hair suspiciously real. One doll's glass eyes seemed mismatched, one cloudy, the other disturbingly lifelike. The stench grew stronger. His lantern beam fell upon a wooden chest in the corner, lid cracked open. Inside lay rolls of linen, but protruding from beneath them was something pale, waxy, unmistakably human. The constable lurched for the door, breath ragged, stomach heaving. He stumbled back into the night air, retching into the gutter as rain pelted his helmet. Behind him, in the dark of the toy shop, the dolls seemed to watch. This is the American crime story by morning. The story had already begun to spread. Neighbors whispered about what the constable had seen, though details blurred with rumor. Some said it was merely spoiled animal parts, others swore human remains had been discovered. But what lingered most in the public imagination was the image of the dolls, their uncanny faces, their two human eyes. The children of Whitechapel began to cross the street rather than walk past Pike's shop. Mothers pulled them close, muttering prayers under their breath. Men shook their heads, muttering about that odd fellow Pike, who worked by lamplight long into the night, speaking to no one, smiling rarely. London was no stranger to grisly tales. The city had lived through the terror of Jack the Ripper less than a decade before. But there was something different about this discovery, something more intimate, more chilling. These were not murders committed in the shadows of an alley. They were horrors woven into toys meant for children, objects of innocence turned into vessels of corruption. And as investigators began their search, one question took root in every conversation, whispered in taverns and markets, in churches and in the crowded tenements. What was Thaddeus Pike really making in that toy shop? What lay within those dolls would soon shock the city to its core. To understand the darkness that seemed to settle within the walls of Thaddeus Pike's toy shop, we must first step back into the world he inhabited in London, at the very turn of the 20th century. It was an age of contradictions. The city was alive with invention and industry. Horse-drawn carriages clattered alongside the first motor cars, while soot from coal fires clung to every brick wall. Gas lamps still lit most of the streets, their glow paling before the promise of electricity that flickered only in the wealthier districts. In the East End, life was harsher. Whitechapel in particular carried a reputation steeped in poverty and crime. Families crowded into single rooms, the air heavy with the smell of refuse, coal smoke, and human sweat. Children ran barefoot through alleys, slick with rainwater and waste. For many, the only toys were rags tied into shapes or marbles carved from stone. To own a fine porcelain doll or a wooden horse was a luxury, a glimpse into a world otherwise far beyond their means. It was here, in these winding streets, that Thaddeus Pike had carved out a living. Thaddeus was born in 1859, the son of a modest woodcarver. His father had shaped furniture legs and banisters for wealthier clients, while his mother took in mending. From an early age, Thaddeus showed unusual patience with his hands. Where other children ran wild through the alleyways, he lingered at his father's bench, whittling scraps of wood into crude figurines. By his teenage years, Pike's skill had outpaced his father's. Neighbors remembered him presenting tiny, intricate animals to children who had nothing else to play with. A rabbit small enough to perch on a fingertip, a horse whose carved mane seemed to ripple with movement. His eye for detail was extraordinary. But there was something else about him, too. He was quiet, reserved, always observing, seldom speaking. Even as a young man, he seemed uncomfortable in crowds, retreating instead into his workshop for hours on end. His shyness might have been dismissed as temperament, were it not coupled with an unsettling intensity. Those who knew him in his early years recalled that he seemed to regard his toys not simply as objects, but as companions. He would polish them, speak softly as he worked, and arrange them in neat, deliberate rows. Some swore he whispered to them long after the shop was closed, his voice carrying into the night through the thin walls of his workshop. By the 1890s, Pike had saved enough to open his own toy shop on Whitechapel Road. The sign he hung bore his name proudly, Thaddeus Pike, toymaker. Inside, shelves soon filled with porcelain dolls, rocking horses, and marionettes whose joints moved with uncanny grace. His work attracted attention. Wealthier families from outside the district sometimes purchased his dolls, marveling at the lifelike quality of the hair, the piercing clarity of the glass eyes. But in the East End, Pike remained something of a curiosity. He was seen walking the streets in a black coat too long for his narrow frame, hat pulled low, eyes cast downward. He rarely joined the men at the tavern, never courted women, and kept to himself with a rigor that felt unnatural. By the close of the century, London was haunted by memory. The murders of Jack the Ripper in 1888 had left scars that would not fade. In Whitechapel especially, suspicion clung to every loner, every man who seemed odd or out of step. Pike, with his reclusive manner and his shop full of staring dolls, became a figure of whispered speculation. Still, there was no reason to fear him, at least not yet. His neighbors may have found him peculiar, but his shop brought color into children's lives, and his business gave him a measure of respectability. The truth of what stirred behind his workshop door remained carefully hidden. It is worth remembering that this was a time before forensic science could easily expose hidden crimes. There were no DNA tests, no fingerprint databases, no psychological profiles. Police investigations relied heavily on witness accounts and physical evidence visible to the naked eye. If a man was clever enough to conceal his activities, if he could maintain the thin veneer of ordinary life, he might carry on in darkness for years unnoticed. And in that darkness, Thaddeus Pike's obsessions deepened. His skill as a craftsman grew ever more precise, but so too did the rumors about his peculiarities. A child claimed that the hair on her doll was real. Another swore its eyes seemed to follow her. Mothers shrugged it off as fancy children's imagination getting the better of them. But beneath the gaslight shadows, a quiet dread began to take hold. There was something about Pike's creations that unsettled the soul, too human, too close to life, as though the dolls carried secrets within their stitched seams. By the dawn of the new century, London was ready to march forward into modernity, but inside one dimly lit toy shop, an old obsession was taking root, one that would transform objects of innocence into instruments of horror. And when the first body surfaced, authorities would finally realize that Pike's skill with his hands had been turned toward something far more sinister than toys. The first disappearance was scarcely noticed. In 1901, a girl named Clara Whitfield vanished on her way home from the market. She was 12 years old, the daughter of a washerwoman who lived off Hanbury Street. Clara was last seen carrying a small loaf of bread wrapped in paper, weaving through the crowded stalls. Witnesses recalled her pausing at the window of Pike's toy shop, pressing her nose to the glass, eyes fixed on a doll in a crimson dress. When she did not return home, neighbors organized a search. They scoured alleyways, knocked on doors, and dragged the Thames near Wapping. But in Whitechapel, children often went missing, some lured into workhouses, others slipping away to beg or steal. Clara's name soon faded into the background noise of poverty. It was only later, when other children disappeared, that her story returned with haunting clarity. By 1902, the disappearances had formed a pattern too distinct to ignore. 3 children, all young girls between 9 and 13, all last seen within a few streets of Pike's toy shop. The East End was no stranger to tragedy, but the regularity of these vanishings planted seeds of fear. Mothers began clutching their children tighter when they passed Whitechapel Road. Fathers warned their little ones not to linger near Pike's window. And yet no proof pointed toward the toy shop. The police had little to go on beyond frightened whispers. Pike himself carried on as usual, opening his doors each morning, arranging dolls and wooden soldiers on their shelves with quiet precision. But behind that facade, a far darker reality was unfolding. The discovery of the dolls came gradually, almost by accident. A young girl from Mile End, whose parents had purchased one of Pike's creations, complained that her toy frightened her. At first it was dismissed as childish fancy, but when her mother examined the doll closely, she noticed the hair was unusually coarse, not the standard horsehair or flax used in dolls of the time. The suspicion grew stronger when a seam split across the doll's torso. Instead of cotton stuffing, there appeared to be something fibrous, stained brown at the edges. The family, unsettled, quietly discarded the doll into the fire. Other stories followed. One boy claimed his doll's eyes were wet in the mornings. Another mother noticed tiny stitches on the back of her child's toy that seemed more suited to flesh than to fabric. Most dismissed such tales as superstition, but unease spread through Whitechapel like a creeping fog. The true horror, however, lay within Pike's workshop. It seemed to begin as an obsession with realism. Pike, ever dissatisfied with manufactured materials, sought ways to make his dolls more lifelike. Sheep's wool replaced cotton. Human hair bought cheaply from wig makers and barbers replaced painted strands. But over time, his experiments took a darker turn. Historians and police records later suggested that Pike scavenged parts from unclaimed corpses at hospitals and workhouse infirmaries. In an era when the poor often went unburied, a small bribe could secure hair, teeth, or even strips of skin. But for Pike, scraps were not enough. He craved freshness, authenticity, flesh still warm with life. The children who vanished were not taken for ransom, nor for cruelty in the common sense. In Pike's fractured mind, they were materials, innocence distilled into raw substance. Their hair became doll wigs, their eyes glassy replacements, their very tissue stitched into seams where fabric should have been. What drove him to this remains a matter of speculation. Some argued madness, others a deep loneliness that twisted into obsession. Neighbors recalled hearing his voice through the workshop door, low and tender as though he were speaking to companions. His dolls, many believed, had become his family. But unlike wood or porcelain, he wanted them to breathe, to carry some essence of the life denied to him. The crimes remained hidden for years, buried beneath poverty, neglect, and disbelief. Each missing child was another sorrow in a city already drowning in misery. Each doll that left Pike's shop carried with it a silent, grotesque secret. It was not until the stench drew constables into his workshop, years later, that the full horror was revealed. Dolls with human hair stitched too carefully to be a coincidence, eyes mismatched, some cloudy with the unmistakable film of death. And within a locked trunk, rolls of linen concealing fragments that no doll should ever contain. The children of Whitechapel had always been warned to beware of the shadows, the alleys, the drunken men who prowled after dark. But few imagined the real terror lay behind the polished glass of a toy shop window, in the smiling faces of dolls meant to bring joy. And when investigators finally pieced together what Pike had done, London would recoil in horror not only at the crimes themselves, but at the chilling intimacy of them. By the winter of 1903, rumors about Pike's toy shop had reached fever pitch. The strange smells, the missing children, the uncanny dolls, each thread wove into a tapestry of suspicion too dark to ignore. Yet suspicion alone was not evidence, and the Metropolitan Police had learned from bitter experience how easily rumor could turn into hysteria. Whitechapel had suffered enough from ghost stories and Ripper phantoms, but the stench that drove the constable to Pike's door could not be dismissed. When investigators entered the toy shop after that night's discovery, they sealed the premises at once. Journalists, always eager for a story, crowded outside, scribbling notes and sketching the building's facade. Inside, detectives lit their lamps and began to unearth the truth. The workshop was a horror preserved in still life. Dolls lined the walls, each one more grotesque under scrutiny. Forensic science was rudimentary in Edwardian London, yet some things required no microscope. Human hair was unmistakable, so too were the tiny teeth set into a doll's mouth, their enamel chipped and irregular, far too real to be crafted. The locked chest proved the most damning. Beneath folds of cloth, detectives uncovered remnants of scraps of flesh, knuckles of bone, and what appeared to be a child's hand, severed crudely at the wrist. The stench was overpowering, sending hardened officers to the street to retch. One young detective reportedly fainted. The workshop became an evidence chamber. Every doll was seized, each dissected under gaslight by surgeons at the nearest infirmary. Reports documented fragments of organic matter stitched into fabric, ligaments, strands of muscle, strips of skin. And yet amid the horror, one question remained unanswered. Where was Thaddeus Pike? The toymaker had vanished. Neighbors claimed they had last seen him 3 days earlier, carrying a large sack toward the rear of the shop. Others reported he had boarded a horse-drawn omnibus heading toward the docks. Police flooded the East End, checking lodging houses, train stations, and taverns. His photograph, grainy and smudged, was posted in constable offices across London. A thin man, mid-40s, eyes sunken, mustache neatly trimmed. Days passed, then weeks. Panic gripped Whitechapel as parents barred their doors at night. Some claimed Pike lingered in the shadows, watching children from alleys. Others swore he had fled England altogether, taking passage on a steamer bound for Europe. But Pike had not fled far. In early 1904, a break came. A night watchman at St. Catherine's Dock reported a strange figure lurking near the warehouses. When approached, the man bolted, leaving behind a satchel. Inside were tools, needles, scissors, twine, stained dark with what appeared to be blood. The watchman swore he recognized the face from the police notice: Thaddeus Pike. Constables tightened their search. For weeks they combed lodging houses along the river, interviewing landlords. One finally confessed that a tenant named Thomas Page had been renting a room under false identity. When officers forced their way inside, they found only an unmade bed, a cracked mirror, and resting on the sill, a doll's head. Unfinished, its hair in tufts, its sockets empty. Pike had slipped away once more. His capture came unexpectedly, in the small port town of Dover. Customs officers, trained to watch for smugglers, intercepted a nervous man attempting to board a steamer bound for Calais. His papers were false, his manner evasive. When asked to open his case, he hesitated. Inside were scraps of fabric, a half-completed doll, and what appeared to be a roll of human skin, carefully scraped and dried. Word traveled swiftly back to London. Thaddeus Pike was in custody. The arrest sent shockwaves through the city. Crowds gathered outside Bow Street Magistrates' Court when he was brought for initial questioning. Witnesses described him as pale, trembling yet oddly composed. He spoke little, his voice soft, insisting the dolls were his children and that he had given them life. The police struggled to extract a confession. Pike often drifted into silence or muttered to himself, refusing to answer directly. Yet the evidence was overwhelming. His shop had become a crypt of horrors. His tools bore traces that medical men identified as human tissue. The missing children's belongings, ribbons, shoes, scraps of clothing, were recovered from trunks in his workshop. Though Pike never admitted outright to murder, his silence was damning. London had its monster. The East End exhaled a breath of relief when his capture was announced. Yet relief was tainted by dread. For though the toymaker was finally in chains, the true number of his victims remained unknown. Had he killed 5 children? 10? More? The dolls gave no answers, only unblinking stares. The trial of Thaddeus Pike began in the autumn of 1904 at the Old Bailey. London, still reeling from the grotesque discoveries in his workshop, turned its collective gaze toward the courtroom. Newspapers splashed lurid sketches of Pike across their pages, branding him the Dollmaker of Whitechapel. Street vendors hawked broadsheets with headlines that screamed of horror: children stolen for toys and monster behind the glass. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy, a blend of fascination and revulsion. Mothers of the missing sat in silence, clutching handkerchiefs, their grief raw and visible. Pike himself cut a pitiful figure. Gone was the tidy shopkeeper with neatly combed hair. In his place stood a gaunt, twitching man, his eyes hollow, his hands trembling as though the very air weighed upon him. The prosecution's case was straightforward, though not without difficulty. No bodies had been recovered intact, only fragments stitched and hidden among his dolls. Yet those fragments, alongside the belongings of missing children, painted a devastating picture. Surgeons testified to their examinations, describing tissue, bones, and hair beyond doubt. Constables spoke of the stench in his workshop, the discovery of the trunk, and Pike's attempt to flee under a false name. What truly chilled the court, however, were the dolls themselves. A dozen were brought in as exhibits placed carefully upon the evidence table. Under the flickering gaslight, their glass eyes and crude seams appeared almost alive. The jurors could scarcely look at them. The defense argued madness. Pike, they claimed, was no murderer but a deluded craftsman, a man who believed he was creating a family out of scraps. His counsel insisted he had never intended harm, that the children's disappearances were unrelated, their fates twisted by rumor and hysteria. But each denial withered under cross-examination. Too many girls gone, too many fragments found in his possession, too much evidence for coincidence, and Pike's own words betrayed him. At one point, when asked why he had used human hair, he murmured, "It keeps their warmth. The dolls don't like to be cold." Gasps echoed across the courtroom. Even the judge shifted uneasily in his chair. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. The verdict, guilty of murder. On a damp November morning, Thaddeus Pike was sentenced to death by hanging. The announcement drew crowds outside the courthouse. Some cheered, others prayed quietly. The families of the missing wept, not in relief, for their children would not return, but in the grim knowledge that justice, however imperfect, had been done. Newspapers feasted on the story in the weeks that followed. Artists sketched grotesque caricatures of Pike, half man and half doll, strings dangling from his limbs. Penny Dreadful seized upon the tale, embellishing it with scenes of ghoulish ritual and necromancy. The real story was monstrous enough, yet it became a myth almost overnight. Pike was executed at Newgate Prison in early 1905. Witnesses reported he said nothing in his final moments, his lips moving in silent prayer or perhaps in whispered conversation with the dolls that had been his only companions. When the trapdoor fell, London exhaled once more. The Dollmaker was no more, but his legacy lingered like smoke in the narrow streets of Whitechapel. Parents held their children tighter. Toy shops across the East End saw their business falter, for customers now eyed dolls with suspicion. For years afterward, children whispered warnings. Don't go near the Dollmaker's shop or he'll take you too. Historians continue to debate the true extent of Pike's crimes. Some records suggest 5 victims, others as many as a dozen. With so little left of the children, certainty was impossible. What remained was a scar on the city's memory, a cautionary tale told in hushed tones, and yet even now, fragments of his work surface from time to time. A doll discovered in a grandmother's attic, its hair too coarse, its eyes disturbingly real. Collectors whisper of pieces traced back to Pike's workshop, though most deny owning them. Museums, when offered such relics, refuse to display them, for there is something uniquely unsettling about Pike's dolls. Not just their crude stitches or their unnatural eyes, but the lingering sense that they carry more than fabric and porcelain, that within them lies the echo of a child's laughter, silenced too soon. The story of Thaddeus Pike is more than a tale of crime. It is a reminder of how the overlooked and forgotten can hide horrors in plain sight. In a city already scarred by poverty, disease, and violence, one lonely toymaker wove his madness into the very playthings meant to bring joy. And so the legend endures, the Dollmaker of Whitechapel, the man who filled his toys with flesh,